Hello, everyone, and welcome to Scream Scene, the horror movie podcast where we watch every horror movie ever made in chronological order, and then we rank them from best to worst. My name's Ben.
And I'm Sarah.
Thank you so much for listening to us today. How are you doing today, Sarah?
Well, last episode you did a bait and switch on me, not intentionally, so I'm hesitantly excited, a little trepidatious.
Got it.
How are you?
I'm doing well because this is our final film of 1960.
Ooh.
I feel like we've been doing 1960 for a while. Now, to be fair,
we had like a year hiatus.
Yes, in the middle there. Well, not really in the middle, right towards the end there. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, this episode's going to come out near the end of 2024 as well. But yes.
Yeah, the bi-weekly nature is thrown off our regular scheduling, but that is all right.
We're getting used to the bi-weekly thing.
So what are we watching?
We are watching The Telltale Heart from 1960, directed by Ernest Morris.
Okay. Now, are you sure?
Yes.
Okay. Because I thought that's what we were covering last time, but we ended up covering a 1934 adaptation of The Telltale Heart, both of which are from the UK.
Yes.
So, okay, if you're sure.
I did bait and switch you last time. If Creatures of the Night missed last week's episode, or if you're listening to the episodes sorted chronologically, where last episode would be sorted as episode 46B, and thus you heard it way back in the 1930s section of episodes, and therefore it's been a while, let's recap briefly The Telltale Heart and what the deal with it is. It's a heart.
Yes.
It tells tales.
Not really.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm not going to go into Poe himself because we've covered him many, many times, as well as in the last recorded episode. So let me just go into the short story itself, and then I'll go through some of the adaptations that we've covered on the show.
For sure.
So the short story was published in January 1843 in the Pioneer magazine. This wasn't a magazine that Poe was working for, but he submitted everywhere because he's trying to make a living just on writing. For context, The Raven is in 2 years, so he hasn't hit that level of fame, hit the peak of his fame yet. But this is still a very noteworthy and well-known short story.
Yes.
Published in 1843, it's kind of known for having that, as with many Poe stories, that unreliable narrator. He lives with an old man, and he gets kind of fixated on this old man's, he calls it an evil eye. So it's like glossy white. Basically, he's blind. He also describes it as vulture-like. So just imagine this bulbous eye. Though, because he's unreliable, it could just be dude's blind. We don't know. So he increasingly becomes anxious and creeped out by the eye. It's not helping that he can't sleep because he hears every single sound, like someone coming up the stairs or the clock ticking. And it gets to the point where the narrator is like, hey, I have to kill this old man. So he sneaks in one night. He actually sneaks in several nights, but the guy's asleep, and he's like, I can't kill him if I can't see this eye. Finally, he sneaks in. The guy wakes up. And so our narrator's like, I must kill him. Now he can hear the heart beating, and so he smothers him, and slowly, you no longer hear the heart. He hides the body underneath the floorboards. Now, unfortunately, a neighbor called the police because the neighbor heard the old man yell. So the police show up, and they're like, we have to do our due diligence. We have to search the property, even though the narrator's like, no, I had a nightmare. That was me yelling. So the police look through, and the narrator starts to hear the beating heart again. And it just starts to overwhelm his senses, even though the police clearly don't hear it. And ultimately, he ends up revealing where the body is. Throughout all of the short story, it's him the narrator retelling the murder, saying how precise and calculated it was. Therefore, he's not crazy. He's not trying to say that he didn't commit the murder. It's more like, I'm sane. Why am I in an asylum? Why are you thinking that I'm a madman? Would a madman wait 7 nights just to wait to see the eye to kill someone? No, I'm patient. Therefore, I am not crazed. Mm-hmm. So that's the short story. Now, this short story, as I said, came out in 1843, before film really was a thing. So you can believe us when we say that the earliest Poe adaptation that we saw for the podcast was back in episode 3 with The Avenging Conscience. Now, that one, like many other horror movies that we saw on the show, kind of take bits and bobs from multiple Poe stories and glom them all together. So The Avenging Conscience does have a scene that's very akin to when the narrator is talking with the police and the beating heart just becomes overwhelming. But it covers many of other Poe's works, including like Annabelle Lee, etc. I'm not going to go into every Poe amalgamation adaptation.
Sure.
Because there's a lot.
Mm-hmm. Can I tell you, I don't know what my like earliest memories of the Telltale Heart are, like knowing of it through pop culture osmosis. Like a lot of Poe stuff, you do kind of pick it up that way as a kid. But the most prominent Telltale Heart rendition in my head to this day is from an episode of The Simpsons.
Okay.
Where like
that makes sense.
Lisa has this like smart girl rival who's like her first real challenger in school, and they have to make dioramas about books they had read. And so they have to make these like dioramas for a school project. And if I remember correctly, it's that Lisa's rival makes this like really excellent Telltale Heart diorama with a little ticking clock like under the floorboards of the diorama.
I 100% remember this.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. And like Lisa like throws it in the trash, try and get rid of it on the day that they're supposed to be presenting. But then like Lisa can hear it ticking in the trash and like goes nuts about it, just like the guy in the story. And then at the end of the day, Ralph Wiggum wins because he brought in a bunch of Star Wars action figures. Anyways, that's my, like, I always hear Yardley Smith as Lisa talking about like the beating of his hideous heart. Anyways.
As far as Telltale Heart adaptations in particular, so we saw the Telltale Heart from 1934. That was covered in episode 45B / released 2 weeks ago. That's from director Brian Desmond Hurst. We ranked it at number 148. So pretty good showing, especially because it really did show the craft and talent of the filmmaker. But it kind of started too high with its anxiety, so it didn't have any place to build. A common thing that horror movies struggle with, even to this day. Mm-hmm. Now, there are 2 adaptations that we watched, but not for the podcast. That's because they are shorts.
Yes, and to reiterate, short films don't qualify for the Scream Scene horror movie list unless they are short films from before feature films were a thing.
Yeah.
Once feature films were a thing, no more shorts for the list. You can argue with that policy. We need to put boundaries down somewhere.
Yeah. So we saw the short from 1941 titled The Telltale Heart, directed by Jules Dassin. This was produced in the US by MGM, and it was Dassin's directorial debut after being an assistant to Hitchcock. It's about 20 minutes, and to kind of summarize it, you know, obviously I'm not going to go through the way that the short story goes through, because it's fairly accurate, except that the old guy gets to be mean this time.
Yeah, in the story, the unreliable narrator is kind of like, the old man never did anything to harm me, but you can't really trust him. In the 34 version, the old man was like explicitly made out to be very, very nice.
The nicest guy.
And in this version from 41, the old man is like Scrooge. If like Scrooge had like a weird blind eye.
Yeah, basically I called the narrator the boy. In this one, he's like 30. He's been working for the old man since he was 14, almost like an indentured servant. And he's clearly mistreated because he gets like slapped around and like demeaned verbally. So, you know, you're kind of with the boy when he goes and kills the old man. But I was really surprised how quickly the murder happens and then it spends the last like 10 minutes, so half of the runtime, with the narrator kind of dealing with the guilt weighing on his conscience. He sees like a tap dripping and he hears like the beating of the heart as the tap is dripping. Same with like the clock ticking, all of that. I thought that was very well done. I really liked it. And he gets his comeuppance. I did laugh at many parts, but that's because I was enjoying it.
Yeah, it's definitely, you can see like, okay, we're in the US and it's a code picture kind of stuff going on.
Yeah.
Like, not only does the old man have to be shitty so that he deserves to die, but like we don't see the murder on screen and
we never see the body.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So you can definitely see the influences of the production code. You
can also see the influences of Hitchcock with his thrillers because the tension is real in here.
Yeah, and I did think that the build up to that tension was handled better here than in the British film from 34, even if the British film had like a lot of cool stylistic touches.
Yeah, it's probably because this one was 20 minutes and that one from 34 was like 50 minutes. Then we watched the 1953 adaptation. This is animated and was directed by Ted Parmel. It's also from the US. It's from Columbia. So the animation studio is UPA. It's narrated by James Mason, and he does a fantastic job. He basically is reading the short story. The animation is so cool. It's so surreal. Apparently, it's the first cartoon to get an X rating from the BBFC. And it contended with Disney at the Academy Awards, but lost ultimately for Best Animation Short. To a short that I disagree with the ruling here.
Right, you didn't care for the Disney short.
Yeah, we watched Disney's short Toot, Whistle, Plunk, Boom, and it was fine, but trust me, you should go look up this 1953 adaptation. It's so heckin' good. I love the surrealness. It's pulling in the Gothic expressionism, but is going further than just an homage. Like you really, even in the opening credits, you feel Dolly in there. And it was just really well done. I think the surreal style really helped.
It's color animation?
Yeah, it's color. And it really helped express the internal thinking of the narrator.
Yes. Very expressionist.
Very. And yeah, just like beautifully done. High end production for the animation here. The sounds going on, like the sound effects and all that. Like, I don't know. I can't praise this enough.
Yeah, it's really good. It's if you haven't heard of it, it is like widely considered one of like the best animated short films of all time. Like it is very highly regarded.
Of all time?
Yeah.
Damn.
Yeah, it's like a really highly regarded short.
Wow. Okay. Well, I haven't seen enough animation to really like say yes or no on that, but I can say it is very, very well done. So yeah, that was 1953.
You want to know a weird fun fact about it?
Yeah.
It's included as a special feature on the DVD of the first Guillermo del Toro Hellboy movie.
I mean, that feels like, because Del Toro is such a fanboy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm into that.
Yeah. It's just like, it has nothing to do with Hellboy, but if you happen to have that DVD, I think you can go and enjoy this short.
Unfortunately, we can't rank it because it was only 7 minutes long, which probably really supported its success in an adaptation.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, this is just the stuff that you need to adapt the short story. There's no extra stuff being added on here.
So then 7 years later, over in the UK, we get this one from Ernest Morris.
Yes. So I'm hoping this is good. I have sort of equal reasons to believe this might be good and equal reasons to believe it might be bad. This film...
The UK has famously been excellent with its horror movies and building tension.
Hey, listen, we like hammer horror. Mm-hmm. So, you know, there's... So, listen. This film was produced by the Danzigers, which would be a familiar name to British TV and moviegoers of like a certain age. Boomers and older. Older boomers and older than boomers. So this is two brothers who were movie producers. Edward J. Danziger was born in New York in 1909, and his brother Harry Lee Danziger was born in 1913. Edward studied law, while Harry studied music. Edward worked on the Nuremberg trials as like a legal assistant.
What the fuck?
There was just like a lot, like so many people had to be employed on those as legal aides.
Yeah, it's just unexpected in the context of a movie podcast.
That's fair. And in the late 1940s, the Danzigers started a sound studio in New York that specialized in dubbing foreign films. From there, they expanded into producing their own movies in 1949. And in 1952, they moved to Britain, where they produced TV movies, B-movies, and television series. Their typical modus operandi was to rent a variety of studio spaces and task screenwriters to create a story using the standing sets of the studios they rented that could be shot within the period that the studios had been rented for.
Yeah, we've heard this story time and time again.
TV episodes produced by the Danzigers would shoot for 2 to 3 days, and feature films, or like B movies really, secondary features, would shoot 8 to 10 days on a budget of £15,000 to £17,000.
Yeah, we've, again, heard this story. So these are the British Cormans?
Yeah, so in this way, they pumped out a very large amount of cheap content to the extent that like their names became well known to Brits of a certain age. You would just see their stuff on TV all the time. In 1956, they bought an abandoned wartime aero engine factory and converted it into sound stages that they called New Elstree Studios. They ran a very efficient business. They were always focused on producing profitable product rather than anything artistic until they sold New Elstree in 1965 and used that money to purchase a chain of hotels and move into the hospitality industry.
They really, they probably had ADHD, huh?
I just think, they were definitely in the movie business for
money.
And they did it as long as it was profitable. And then as like the mid 60s were coming around and it was harder to like make money on cheap movies like that, it was like, all right, time to flip this studio and get into a better business.
From the Nuremberg trials to hotel chains.
Right, exactly. So the screenplay for this 78-minute adaptation was written by regular Danziger writer Brian Clemens. Brian Clemens was born in 1931 in Croydon, and he originally wanted to be a journalist, but he didn't have any qualifications, so he went into advertising instead.
Classic. That's how I got into advertising.
He started writing for the Danzigers while his day job was writing copy. He is perhaps best known by British audiences for his copious writing after the Danzigers stopped making films for shows like Danger Man and The Avengers. For our younger listeners, that's the British television series The Avengers from the 1960s, starring Patrick Macnee and a variety of female secondary leads that was the thing most people thought of when they heard the phrase The Avengers until that Marvel movie made $1 billion. Now, Clemens did not create the Avengers, but he was such a prolific writer on the show that by series 4, he had been promoted to head writer, which coincided with Diana Rigg joining the show as Emma Peel and the series getting picked up in the US. So sort of his episodes of the Avengers are the ones that are most famous on this side of the pond. Clemens would go on to create the New Avengers series in 1976, and his feature film career would continue with both horror titles like Watcher in the Woods and adventure movies like The Golden Voyage of Sinbad. So he's got a bunch of movies that we'll end up seeing for the podcast in future.
Okay.
The Telltale Heart was directed by Ernest Morris and shot by James Wilson, both of whom were part of the regular Danziger team. Actor Laurence Payne plays the murderer here. He was 41 years old at the time of shooting, and he'd been acting on stage since 1931 and on film since 1946. We last saw him in 1958's The Trollenberg Terror, aka The Creeping Eye.
Yeah.
He was like the British reporter in that
Cool.
movie. Our murder victim here is played by Dermot Walsh, who was 36 at the time.
But he's playing the old man?
He is playing the guy who gets killed, yes. And he would play King Richard in the Danziger's 1962 Richard the Lionheart TV series. Scottish actress Adrienne Corri, who was 29 years old when this movie was made, plays our love interest. She made her film debut in 1949, and she had appeared in the Danziger sci-fi flick Devil Girl from Mars in 1954. Corri was a sort of stereotypical firebrand Scottish redhead who was known for her feisty and tempestuous personality. She was a regular on TV and stage, and she had a very long film career, including Corridors of Blood in 1958, Dr. Zhivago in 1965.
Sorry. Just Corridors of Blood to Dr. Zhivago.
She was in like a Pink Panther movie in the 70s, and she might be best known for her appearance in A Clockwork Orange in 1971, where she plays the role of Mrs. Alexander, who is brutally assaulted by Malcolm McDowell's character, and she handled the 40 takes of her assault scene with total aplomb, no problem. Just like, yeah, sure, let's do it again. Do you have problems with being in a nude scene, Miss Corri? Absolutely not. Malcolm, you're going to find out if I'm a real redhead or not. Did
she really say that?
She really said that.
Oh my God.
She super impressed Stanley Kubrick because of just like how effortlessly she nonchalant she was about shooting with him, to the point where like there's this story that like they kept up a correspondence afterwards. And one year, Kubrick was like in a letter complaining to her about his socks always going missing in the wash. And so for Christmas that year, she sent him a pair of red socks, which is a reference to the fact that in her scene in the movie, she is only wearing a pair of red socks. So the script for this sort of drastically diverges from the Poe story in expanding it out to, you know, an almost hour and 20 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, you have to.
Absolutely. But despite this, The Telltale Heart was reviewed enthusiastically by British critics upon its release in December of 1960. Now, we really like a lot of British horror films, but typically the best British horror films are the ones that critics hated.
Oh, that's true.
So if this one got a lot of good reviews, like, does that mean it's good or does that mean it is bad?
Yeah.
So it's like, you see what I mean when I said like it's 50-50, like the writer of this is well known, you know, but like the producers and the directors are known for like cheap schlock. The critics liked it, but is that a good thing? I don't know. What I do know is that the film has lapsed into the public domain and is available on DVD and YouTube.
Okay. Well, folks, if you would like to watch along and see which way this 50-50 split goes, you can find a copy of this movie on our YouTube playlist at screamscenepodcast.com. You're going to hear a brief musical interlude, and when we come back, we will discuss The Telltale Heart from 1960, directed by Ernest Morris. Welcome back to Scream Scene. We just finished watching The Telltale Heart from 1960, directed by Ernest Morris. Ben, first thoughts?
This wasn't bad.
Yeah, I really liked this. It has some major flaws that we will talk about, but despite, this being an adaptation, so you kind of know what to expect, this movie did exceed my low expectations.
That's fair, yeah. It's quite a departure from the short story, except for the climax. But given that there isn't really much to the short story outside of the climax, I'm not entirely opposed to building a whole new story just around that famous climax.
Yeah. So let me give the synopsis.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I feel like this maybe needs, I don't know, the way this started, the structure of it was a little odd. So let me just set the scene here.
Yeah.
So I'll say pre-credits. So, you see part of the movie and then the credits come up. We see our main character, who we later learn his name is Edgar. He's creeping down the stairs and he's hearing the beating heart. He goes to the piano and he's like, oh no, it's the metronome. And then it stops and the heart continues beating. And he then throws the metronome down on the floor and crumbles to the floor. And you see the rug underneath the piano kind of beating with a heart. So very strong opening. Then we get the credits. And then we get a little thing after the credits. That character, Edgar, he awakes screaming. His maid rushes in, and she had gone off to get his best friend, Carl. Now, the maid does call this character who's screaming Mr. Poe. Mm-hmm. So look how clever we are. This is Edgar Allan Poe, apparently.
Also, this building he's living in is on the Rue Morgue.
You're jumping the gun.
No, they show that first. They show the Rue Morgue sign, and then they pan over to him.
To him screaming
Yeah.
that first time? Okay,
Yeah.
cool. All right, yes, we are in the Rue Morgue.
A fictional street in Paris from a different Edgar Allan Poe story.
Yeah, but we're being clever, Ben. Mm-hmm. Now there's paper strewn all about the apartment, and he's like, oh no, it was just a nightmare. Next scene, we see this character, Edgar, kind of going about his day. Now, to share a bit more about this character, he is very nervous around women. He is, I'll say 30-ish, judging by the character's age. He lives alone in a large house, so he has money. But he tries to talk to, actually no, he can't even try to talk to a woman who happens to be a sex worker, because he gets too flustered and then storms out and then heads back to his house to look at pornography and masturbate.
He's a librarian.
He is a librarian. The next day after that scene, he sees that there's a redhead moving in across the street. Her name turns out to be Betty. Now, he does try to go talk to her at her job at the florist, but he really can't. But his friend Carl encourages him, and they end up going on a date. Unfortunately, Edgar's a little too forward, tries to make out with her, and she essentially slaps his face, and he has to walk away. They do reconcile the next day. Part of him being a little too forward is the fact that in his bedroom, he can look across the street and see into her bedroom. So before they even go on a date, he's been watching her and watching her change, all that fun peeping Tom stuff.
And I just want to state here that her bedroom windows, they don't face onto the alley. They're not facing out onto the back of the building. They face out the front of the building onto the street, and she changes with her candles all lit and the curtains wide open. And I just don't find that to be particularly believable, but she seems to be completely unaware of the fact that someone
can see her,
can look in and see her, but he can see her just fine.
Oh, and just so it's said, this is a period piece.
Yes, they did set this in Victorian times.
In France.
Yes. Everyone has a very English accent, like London accents, but we are supposedly in Paris.
So because they have reconciled, Edgar and Betty continue going out, and she eventually meets Carl, and sparks fly. Edgar is completely oblivious to the waves of attraction coming off of Betty towards Carl, and later from Carl towards Betty.
It's sort of like when you're watching Revenge of the Sith, and Anakin and Padme are supposed to have a romantic relationship, but all of the chemistry is between Natalie Portman and Ewan McGregor.
All of the chemistry is Ewan McGregor and everyone.
That's fair. The other weird thing that comes out of these scenes as we see Edgar taking Betty out on dates and like Carl getting to know them better and so on is we find out that Edgar's last name
is Marsh.
Yes, he's Edgar Marsh. His friend is Carl Lewis.
The dryer. I'm kidding. I don't know what his last name is. It doesn't matter.
But it really confused us when this came out in the film. More on that later.
So Betty invites herself over during Edgar and Carl's weekly chess game and is continually like, you'd have to be blind, so I guess Edgar must be blind, to not see the advances that she's making towards Carl. And he reciprocates after they all three of them go out for dinner. Now, at the end of that dinner, Edgar walks Betty to her door, tries to make out again, and is rebuffed. And from his window up in his room, he sees Carl and Betty making out in her apartment, and they end up fucking.
It's just such a like...
Remember, we are set in Victorian times. She's a respectable lady.
Yeah, no, it's just the fact that like you didn't go for like they have sex, that you just write to like they're fucking.
Now, Carl plans to tell Edgar in the morning because he does feel guilty about this. And he does feel like a sense of love with Betty and her to him. It's not just a fling. So they do establish these things. But during the night, Edgar's maid gets an urgent message to Carl saying that he has to see Edgar tonight because he's ill and he needs him. So Carl rushes in and Edgar kills Carl, beating him to death with a fire poker. And we get to see it. We get to see it, Ben.
It's very bloody, too.
It's very bloody. Then he, this is upstairs, so then he gets to, like, drag the body down the stairs, and Edgar drops Carl's body, and he goes tumbling a little bit, and he gets buried beneath the floorboards underneath the piano, which is maybe a little significant because Carl was playing the piano all fancily earlier. Betty doesn't believe the story that's been concocted that Carl left town. He's been a bit of a playboy and a fuckboy in the past, so the police are like, yeah, he's done this. But she doesn't believe that. And while she sleuths and tries to figure out where he's gone, Edgar's guilt begins to grow and overtakes him. And we get these really cool sequences of the house appearing to like be moving from like the beating of the heart to the point where like his knickknacks and tchotchkes and chess pieces even are like moving with the beat of the heart. He ends up cutting out, like taking out the floorboards and cutting out Carl's heart, and it's pulsing, and he goes and buries it in the backyard, and still it beats. And we get to see all of it.
Yeah, it's really cool. And I also kind of respected the fact that the movie doesn't do anything obvious to make it clear that, like, these are hallucinations of Edgar's.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Like,
yeah.
When, like, even though, like, logically we have to know that they are, right? Like, people's hearts don't beat after death. They certainly don't beat after they've been... like
removed from the
body. They don't beat after you've like buried them in some sod outside. So this has to be hallucinations, right?
Yeah.
But the movie doesn't do anything obvious to signal that. They film this as if it's actually happening.
I mean, I think they know that the audience knows the story.
Yeah, but that's like what I'm saying is like I appreciate that the movie doesn't, I don't know, like have him like waking up or like have like a halo around the scene to indicate like this is a dream or, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Now, Betty is growing suspicious of Edgar. He neglects to tell her, and she finds out that he had that note sent to Carl and all this. So she goes snooping and finds the murder weapon in his house. Finally, the police come to search, And this is when the tension and anxiety on Edgar, which has clearly been growing based off of the actor's performance, comes to a climax, and he can't hide it anymore. He reveals the body. And then he wakes up screaming, and apparently it's Poe from that beginning scene. Carl rushes in. He's like, don't worry, it was only a dream. Like, you're okay. You're just ill still. And Edgar's like, oh, it was the most terrible nightmare. You were there, and I was there. And then, like, the neighbor across the street, and Carl's like, but you don't have a neighbor. And then, like, Edgar looks out the window, and someone's moving in, and it's the same actress, but her hair is dark because that makes her look more like Edgar's actual wife. Just moving in. And that's the end of the movie.
So, do we want to start with what we liked about this or what we didn't like?
Well, I will just say that, because you brought it up when we first came in, that as an adaptation, they obviously add things to the short story.
Yeah.
There's no old man here, you know? But I think they did a really good job of fleshing things out. And I think that the vibe from the short story is maintained, both in the sense of, you know, the heart beating, but also the vibe that Edgar Allan Poe would bring in his stories.
Sure. I think that atmosphere and that tension and that like rising sense of anxiety, right, that informs the story is all here. I do think that in changing so much of the story around that climax, they have, you know, probably eliminated what was like the point of the story to begin with. All the stuff about like, you know, I'm not crazy. Let me prove it to you. I'm totally rational, and like the unreliable narrator, and like those questions of, you know, if someone's insane, are they responsible for murder? Blah, blah, blah. Like that's all gone from here. But I do appreciate, even if it's like kind of the most basic story in terms of like, oh yeah, like they killed each other. He killed him over a woman, right? That's very basic. But at least it means that the love interest who's been added to the story has a point, as opposed to the 34 version, which added a love interest who really has nothing to do with anything, right? Is just there to be a woman in the movie. And
in this film, she's active.
Right.
Like she's the one who gets the police there.
Yes.
So yeah, as an adaptation, obviously different than the short story, but I think it achieves and sustains the vibe. And Edgar Allan Poe loves to pair in the idea of like pity and tragedy with horror. And I think that is also sustained here.
Yeah, I think that Laurence Payne is doing a really great job as Edgar. I think he handles that like slow escalation of anxiety really well. It's really interesting to see the way his personality shifts from like the kind of like, oh, I couldn't possibly talk to someone like beginning through to like kind of how confident and cocksure he gets after killing Carl, to like how, you know, insane with guilt and anxiety he's getting by the end. I kept joking that I was getting Joaquin Phoenix as Arthur Fleck from the Joker movies kind of vibes off of him. Like it's very much that same sort of character, that like incel murderer character, I guess.
And speaking of the incel element, I really feel like this movie was influenced by Peeping Tom.
Yeah.
Like beyond just the fact that Edgar's literally peeping, the impotence of the main character, like I think is really captured here. And they don't shy away from it. Like Peeping Tom really pushed boundaries, and critics and audiences just really repelled against it. Whereas here, like the critics were really a fan of this. And that probably has something to do with the like claim to legitimacy of literature and it being a period piece.
Yes.
But it still like goes for it. It goes for the blood. It goes for the gore. Like I was impressed by these things. Yeah,
it's definitely, I think, the period piece, adaptation nature, the black and white, the fact that the movie isn't drawing a line between sort of voyeurism and murder to the act of making and watching a movie, right? Like there is a lot of reasons why the very similar subject matter here didn't get as much pushback as Peeping Tom. I definitely enjoy the horror additions to the story, namely that whole sequence of cutting Carl's heart out and burying it in the peat moss.
That was so good. And like, here's the thing, when we were watching like the shorts, for example, or even the one from the 40s that we just watched, like show me the body under the floorboards, and we get like a close-up. We don't get to actually see the knife go into the cadaver and pull out the heart, but
we see the heart in his hands.
You see the heart in his hands as he pulls it up, and then you later see the body with the, you know, the T-scar.
Okay, so this is the wildest thing in this fucking movie. So coming back, that discussion of it's not made clear like what's hallucination and what's real for Edgar, which is really interesting. I'm trying to think of like movies before this in the horror genre that pulled that trick. And really, like, I think it goes back to like Caligari. But when I think into the future, again, I am thinking of Joker, because there's like vast portions of those movies where it's unclear if what you're seeing is in Arthur Fleck's mind or not. But I'm also thinking of American Psycho, where it's unclear how much of the movie was just totally in Patrick Bateman's head. And the reason I bring all this up is, okay, so he's hearing the heart and it's making his house shake, and he goes and he cuts the heart out of the cadaver. And this is like, I don't know if it's halfway through the movie, but it's like a significant amount before the end. And he buries it outside. And I was like, wow, he solved the problem of the telltale heart. Like, how are they going to like catch him now? Like, this guy is so much smarter than all the other telltale heart murderers and all the other adaptations we've seen up till now. And then...
Did you try removing the heart?
Right. And then later... he starts hearing the beating again. And he's like, well, that can't be right. Like, I buried it in the yard or whatever. And he goes and he tears up the planks again. And this is still before the cops come. This is like a second time before the cops come that he tears the planks up. And he finds the body, and it's got this T-scar over the chest that is like fully healed. Like, it's a scar, right? It's not, like, he shouldn't have a scar if he cut him open after death, is what I'm saying. And who closed the scar? Like, who sewed it shut?
Yeah.
And also, the heart's back in there, right? And this has to all be hallucinatory, because otherwise there's like a weird supernatural heart that's actually haunting him, right? And so, yeah, the movie goes to like some really wild places with the horror and really plays with the idea of everyone knows how this story goes.
Yeah. Even the fact that it opens with him coming down the stairs and facing the heart. When it happens in the actual movie, it's different.
Yes.
And I really appreciated that, because I was like, okay, here we go. I can check out a little bit. And then it kept, like, it did other things. And I was like, oh, I need to check back in.
Yes. Now, that does segue into one of my only real complaints about this movie, which is the structure and framing sequence, which is confusing.
Yes.
And at first, once I realized that the opening scene of Mr. Poe waking up in his apartment surrounded by papers and everyone being like, it's all right, had to be a framing sequence. Basically, once we learned that Edgar's last name is Marsh in the main story, I was like, oh, okay, so that was a framing sequence. And it is, we come back to it at the end. But then I was like, you can't show me stuff from the Edgar Marsh story as a prologue to the framing sequence. Structurally, that doesn't make sense. But then I realized that the prologue scene is the nightmare that he's waking up from after the credits. And then he goes back to sleep and has the rest of the nightmare. Like you said when you're giving the plot summary, there's a lot of like, oh, aren't we being clever about this? But I really dislike it, because it's trying to be clever, but it doesn't make any fucking sense. And I just want some runway to complain about this a little bit.
All right, here you go.
It's unnecessary.
Yeah.
Like, it's 1960, gang. We don't need to have it was all a dreamy meme fucking framing sequence. We're adapting Telltale Heart. Second, it's confusing and poorly done, because once he goes back to sleep, there's no initial indication that Edgar Marsh in the story is not the same person as Edgar Allan Poe from the framing sequence. And so it is like initially confusing. We were like, oh, why isn't his apartment filled with all his papers again? I thought he was ill. Like, wait, his last name is Marsh? Like, what's going on? Right? So it's confusing. I really dislike the like bald-faced ahistorical nature of it. Now, we haven't watched a lot of, we've watched a lot of Edgar Allan Poe adaptations. What we haven't watched is there's like a weird subgenre of Edgar Allan Poe biopics that like to heavily fictionalize his life to make it seem like the stuff in his stories happened to him, or that he was some sort of mystery solving guy or whatever. And they're bad, and I dislike them.
They do that with Arthur Conan Doyle as well.
Right. This goes, to me, a step too far. Like, this is like crossing a line here to me, where it's...
Poe never went to France.
Right. Poe never lived in France. Also, the Rue Morgue
is fake.
It's not there is no Death Street in Paris, right? And so it would be like if I was doing...
You can make a street a Death Street.
Sure, but there's no street with a street sign that says Death Street. And like, he never lived in Paris. And he didn't fall in love with some chick across the street from... None of this happened to him. And then to imply that these events and this dream inspired the writing of Telltale Heart, I guess it gives them like a weird excuse for why it's so different. It's like, oh yeah, this dream was just the inspiration for the story. The story can be very different. But also by framing it as like, oh, this is the real inspiration, it makes it seem like the movie's trying to say like, this story is more the real story than the story we based it on. And I hate that in adaptations so much. And I see it so like weirdly often in adaptations where it's like, this is the real story. And I just find that to be really insulting to the original author, because it's presuming that the changes you've made for the adaptation are making the story more like authentic or better. It frustrates me, and I don't like it. We shouldn't have to do this. This is not necessary.
Can I respond?
Yes.
What you're saying and what you're feeling is valid. But to address some of your points, the confusion, I think, is the point, because they're wanting to make you think that the dream is real. Mm-hmm. If someone came in late, they left during the credits to go get popcorn and came back in, they don't have that framing narrative.
Right.
Right? So I think it was, almost a way to like soften things. As I said, your points are valid. This is just another side of it. B, I think you are putting words in the filmmakers' mouths of them saying that this is the real story. They're just trying to be clever. They're shooting period because that's the sets and costumes they had, right? They made this super cheaply. And so they were like, oh, what can we do? Oh, what if it was like this? Like, they aren't putting... this isn't a conspiratorial attempt to change the legacy of Poe. So...
I get that they're just having fun.
Yeah.
Like, I get that they just think they're being clever and they're just having fun. The reason it bothers me is because I have seen a weirdly high number of movie adaptations of books where, like, they'll change the story dramatically and then the movie will still end with, I don't know, a shot of the author of the novel, like, signing his name to the manuscript and being like, and that's the way the story goes. And it's like, no, it's not actually. And just, I don't know, it's like if we watched a movie about George Lucas and it was, here he is waking up in his home on the planet Tatooine. It's like, wait, you can't do that.
I completely agree that the Poe tie-in stuff is very cringe and eye-roll worthy. I would say that it was all a dream. This is not the most egregious example that we've seen.
Sure.
Even though whoa, just kidding. Think about Beast with Five Fingers and the way that one just like fucking
terrible.
undercut itself at the knees. This at least tries to, oh no, is it actually going to happen because the neighbor's moving in?
You know what it feels like? It feels like they're trying to do Dead of Night with like the cyclical narrative.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and this is also UK.
Yeah. With, the dream is now happening for real, right? That Dead of Night does.
Yeah. Yeah, I can get behind that. Yeah, I thought that this was fairly well done. It was shot well, like really shot well. I thought it was very well acted.
I think it's well written. I think even though the, spurned guy whose best friend steals his girl and then I'm going to kill him and whatever, that's like a very well-worn plot line. I think the observations of human psychology that the movie makes of like what that kind of person is like that kind of incel, anxious, shy around women, but also possessive of women, kind of dangerous, murderous type of guy. Like, I think this movie does a good job of like showing what that kind of person is like. All the other characters feel like real people too. Like the way that Betty is, she's moved into a new town and she meets Edgar and he's the only guy she knows, and so it's nice to have someone taking her out, but he's kind of weird and he's kind of a creeper. And so like she meets Carl and she's just throwing herself at Carl to be like, rescue me, rescue me, I need to escape. And the way that Carl like resists her for a very long time, frankly, because she's Edgar's girl, until finally it's okay, yeah, you've twisted my rubber arm enough, you know.
He tries to tell Edgar without actually saying it, no, I don't think I should join you for dinner, and trying to build those barriers. But Edgar is so blind and he's like, no, the more the merrier.
Yeah. Another movie plotline that would be solved
by polyamory.
Right, correct.
But I think that I don't know if it would solve it because I don't think Betty wants Edgar at all.
No, that's true. But yeah, like these people feel like well-observed people who behave in ways that feel human. So yeah. I think it's well written in that way. As a concluding note is I think that the 1953 animated short of The Telltale Heart is probably the best adaptation of the short story.
100%. I would say that like probably second to that is I feel like it's from the 90s or so, maybe the aughts, but Christopher Lee narrated an animated.
Oh yeah. That Edgar Allan Poe like animated anthology film. Yeah.
That was really good, but it's not as surreal. They take a more realistic approach to it.
If you haven't seen that 1953 short, like look it up on YouTube. I think though, as a feature film, this is better than the 1934 movie, even though the 34 movie is more accurate to the short story and its intentions.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to call out that the vibe is there, even if the words on the page are expanded upon.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to ranking.
Very well.
Good examples of bumbling cops in this, though. Just like the worst cops. Maybe bumbling is not the right word.
Bumbling's not the right word. No, like realistically ineffective.
Yes.
Like not even, I wouldn't even say like bad at their jobs, but just like very realistic in the sense of not believing this woman who's bringing problems to them because no, it can't possibly be that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So for context, the 1934 Telltale Heart is ranked at number 148.
Yes. So I was looking above that.
I was as well.
And I ended up with like a bit of a range.
Okay.
So what's funny is I ended up looking as my ceiling kind of in the area that I was thinking about putting the 34 version until you talked me down. Basically, I set my ceiling at Lady Vampire at 114 on a Kyuketsuki. I don't think this is better than that. But below that is movies like The Wasp Woman and Cult of the Cobra that have interesting things to say, but maybe aren't technically good movies. And this movie, I think, is maybe better made than those. I'm not sure. Looking down the list where my floor is is number 137, The Undead, which is like the weird medieval Corman movie where she like Bridie Murphy's back to like interpretive dance witch times.
Yeah.
And right below that is The Monster of Piedras Blancas. I think this is definitely better than Monster of Piedras Blancas. So that's what my range looks like 115 to 136, somewhere in there.
We're in trouble, Ben.
Oh, no.
Night Monster is down here. Really? You think Night Monster goes against Telltale Heart?
Well,
these are different. They are in different weight classes, Ben.
The problem is that Fall of the House of Usher and Phantom of the Convent are down here.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Look, that was the bottom of my range.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's your range?
I'm really worried about this, Ben.
Okay.
So I started, because we had that long hiatus, I was like, let's see where other 1960 movies are, just to refresh my mind. Especially because this was like the first movie that felt like it had been influenced by Peeping Tom, which came out this year.
Right.
And so going down the list, looking at 1960 movies, and my eyes fell to The City of the Dead at number 20.
Uh-huh.
And I was like, I prefer that movie, but in terms of the vibe that hit right for me, this feels like a good ceiling for me.
That's so high.
I know. We have like 100 spots between us. Okay, focusing.
Listeners, we have had a long hiatus, so just to remind y'all, Sarah likes gothic stuff.
If you couldn't tell. No, City of the Dead was so good and like had like dead birds and an actual human sacrifice, and this movie
it had a whole like cool like cult town, like it was like like it had some Lovecraft vibes, but if Lovecraft did like witches instead of tentacles, like it was very good.
And this Telltale Heart, like it gave us gore, it gave us a beating heart in the dude's hands. Like I thought it really went for it. I think it's absolutely better made than some of the movies in your range. But that was my ceiling, number 20. I was like, it's not going above this.
Okay.
Especially because right below that is Black Sunday, another really good movie. And as I looked down, my eyes kind of fell to La Diabolique at number 25. That movie really went for it in the climax, and where like the lady actually dies from the heart attack. But then it's like the inspector comes out and he's like, well, glad we caught you. And it just feels very like it undercuts itself. And I was like, okay, so maybe this feels a little in the right range, because while this movie also has It Was All a Dream, it doesn't, because it has that like cyclical nature you called out, I don't feel like it tries to like cut itself at the knees. Looking further down, I came to House on Haunted Hill at 31. Macabre is right below that. And of course, Murders in the Zoo before that. And I was like, the horror in House on Haunted Hill is more spoopy. Like it's good, but it's definitely like, let's have fun with it. Whereas the horror in Telltale Heart, like, is nightmarish and you're stuck there. And so I felt like a really good range for me was 20 to 31.
So I can't go anywhere near that high. Like this movie.
But you hear what I'm saying, right? Like you at least
I'm hearing what you're saying.
Yeah.
But like my reaction to this movie was that it wasn't bad. Like I was like,
yeah, it wasn't bad. It was good.
Yeah.
Okay, well, what's the midpoint between us?
Okay. So I just want to say, I get what you're saying, but this movie is not as well made as like any of these movies. It's not as iconic. It's good, but it's very, very B movie. It's very, very TV movie. Like I can't. The midpoint between our two ranges, between your floor and my ceiling, is number 75, Back from the Dead from 1957, which is the one about the guy's ghost wife, if I'm remembering correctly. Above that, 74, is Frankenstein 1970, which you should remember. And 76, just below that, is I Was a Teenage Werewolf. This feels better to me as a place to be.
Oh, Dead of Night is right here at 80.
Yes, at 80.
And The Maze with Frog Boy.
Yes, and also I don't think I would go higher than Queen of Spades at 1959. Like, Laurence Payne is very good as Edgar Marsh, but he is not Anton Walbrook good.
No, that's fair. Looking in this area, I think this feels good. I feel like this movie is better than Dead of Night at the very least because it doesn't try to segue into comedy with that golf segment.
Yeah, the thing that's always going to bring down Dead of Night is the fucking golf segment, the golf ghosts.
But even just thinking about the way that they handled madness of that guy with the puppet versus the madness of the heart and it feeling so real.
Yeah,
I feel like it's,
I think Michael Redgrave is a better performer than Laurence Payne.
He's a Redgrave.
Okay, yes.
Dementia is at 82.
Yeah.
And Abominable Snowman. Oh, and Bucket of Blood. Fuck, Ben.
Yeah.
Fuck.
There's some good shit here, man. I think the highest I would go, now that we're down in this zone, I don't think I would go higher than Queen of Spades. I could put this above Frankenstein 1970, maybe. The lowest, I think this is probably better than Horrors of the Black Museum.
Yeah.
What feels right to you?
Okay, Vampire Cowboy is down here. Abominable Snowman is down here. I think, I know people love The Tinkler. I think this was better than The Tinkler. El Hombre y el Monstruo is down here. I think Telltale Heart from 1960 should go at the new number 86, below Curse of the Undead, but above El Hombre y el Monstruo.
I will agree with you. I like The Tingler better than you do.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't put this above The Tingler, but we gotta come to some compromise here somewhere, right?
Do you agree about it going above El Hombre?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I just think The Tingler should have been higher to begin with.
To boot.
But we
okay.
put The Tingler lower because you didn't like it as much as me, so that's fine. So yes, I am good with this position, number 86.
Okay, cool. If you would like to see this list that we have decimated now.
That we stress over every episode.
You can find it on our website at screamscenepodcast.com. If you would like to contest this or any other ranking, you can drop us a line through our Ask box on Tumblr, or you can reach out over email at screamscenepodcast@gmail.com.
Scream Scene updates every other Wednesday on SoundCloud, Spotify, Apple Podcasts still exists, I think. You can find it irregardless of the service through our RSS feed if you want regular updates. And you can support the show by heading over to our Patreon at patreon.com/Scream Scene Podcast, where you can become a patron of the night for as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels, get access to all kinds of cool bonus content.
So what are we watching next week, Ben?
Next week, Sarah, we are watching our first film of 1961.
Oh, wow.
And it is a obscure regional horror movie.
Okay.
Shot in the southeastern United States called The Dead One. And it is the first color zombie movie.
Okay.
Or lays claim to the title of first color zombie movie, I should say.
Interesting. What do you mean by regional?
So it wasn't made in Hollywood. It didn't get a wide release across the United States. It was made by people in the southeastern United States, for those territories, basically.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure it's a voodoo style zombie.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, we will see you then, creatures of the night.
Bye.
Bye.